I have finally got my RX 9070 XT. AMD said something really interesting during their announcement of this card, mentioning that they want it to be a drop-in experience for people upgrading their graphics cards. With this benchmark, I'm only going to be doing eSport titles to see how the RX 9070 XT performs with a budget system. So let's see how this one plays out. For this system, we'll be using some pretty basic stuff. So for the CPU, we have a Ryzen 5 5600 that's stock. I have a stock AMD Wraith cooler on it. For the GPU, we of course have the RX 9070 XT. This is the ASRock Taichi model, and it will be running with stock settings. Its BIOS profile will be on the OC mode as well. For RAM, we only have 16GB of GDDR4 3200 CL16, and for this to truly be an older build, we have my old Asus Prime B350M-A motherboard. I've had this motherboard since 2017 and it's still going strong. This will all be on a test bench system as well, so it will be an open case. We'll be on Windows 10 on the latest update, and we'll be using the latest AMD drivers. All games will be tested on a 3-run average. Ray tracing of course will be off. FSR upscaling will be off, but I will let you know when it's on in some titles. And SAM is enabled. Let's head on to our first game. Let's start off with our first game being Call of Duty Warzone at high and ultra settings. So we find at 1080p we achieved 111 FPS for average FPS, and 1440p we got 113. So very similar between the two resolutions in terms of average FPS for the RX 9070 XT. However, on the 1% lows, we have a difference of 9 FPS between the two 1% lows at 1080p and 1440p. So it's a slight decrease at 1440p compared to 1080p. For this video as well, I just want to bring up GPU and CPU utilization rates, as these are eSport titles. So as we can see, for the CPU utilization rate in terms of percentage, we're around about 50% for both the 1080p and 1440p results. And the GPU utilization rate at 1080p was 81% and at 1440p was 92%. So of course it increases from 1080p to 1440p, but we can say for sure that the 5600 in terms of Call of Duty Warzone can definitely handle the RX 9070 XT. Next up we have Counter-Strike 2 at very high settings, and at 1080p we got an average FPS of 217 FPS, while at 1440p we had a slight uplift in FPS to 235. We also find the same thing with the 1% lows at 96 FPS for 1080p and 113 FPS for 1440p at 1% lows. We can see that the CPU and GPU utilization rate were both at 79% at 1080p, and at 1440p the GPU utilization rate increased slightly to 85% and the CPU utilization rate went down to 67%. Kinda interesting that we have a better result on 1440p than 1080p. In F1 24 we had a pretty strong result at 1080p being 293 FPS on average, and at 1440p it dropped just to 258 FPS on average. So around about a 12% difference. The 1% lows were pretty good though, being around about the same, so at 1080p 182 FPS on average and 178 FPS on average for 1% lows at 1440p. We can also see that the CPU utilization rate did go down slightly from 1080p to 1440p from 63% to 58%, but the GPU utilization rate, of course, it went up from 89% to 95%. Really good result, and we can clearly do some high refresh games. Next we have Fortnite on DX12 with the Epic settings. I will also be doing the performance settings in just a moment. So on the Epic settings, at 1440p we got 86 FPS on average, and on 1% lows we got 56 FPS. On 1080p we got 114 FPS on average, and we got 71 FPS for 1% lows. Now we can see that's a pretty big drop off between the two resolutions, with the average FPS being a percentage difference of 24.6% and the 1% lows being a difference of 21.1%. I'd also like to note the high GPU utilization rate on 1080p and 1440p, both being 96.26 at 1080p and 98.43 on 1440p. So let's take a look at Fortnite performance settings now. Let's have a look at Fortnite with performance settings on at 1440p. As we can see here, we get a significant uplift in average FPS, going from 86 on normal 1440p epic settings to 307 on performance mode. Our 1% lows are a lot better as well at 117. We can also see that the GPU utilization rate has gone down from the 96% on 1080p and 98% at 1440p to on the performance mode at 1440p being 53.1%. CPU utilization rate has also fallen to 65%. We can clearly see that with our setup with the 5600 and the 9070 XT, we're good to go for competitive Fortnite and above 240 Hz, which is awesome to see. Since these are esport games only, of course I'm going to have a look at League of Legends on very high settings in ARAM. So there's pretty much no difference between the two resolutions. We can see here clearly at 1440p we achieved an average FPS of 327, same at 1080p, and the 1% low is pretty much the same, just slightly better on 1080p at 179 compared to 175 on 1440p. Either way, this game is really just not that hard to run, and as you can see as well with the GPU and CPU utilization rates, we already have a completely overkill build for this game. Next we have Overwatch on DX12 with epic settings, and I will be doing this with some medium FSR settings in just a moment as well. I apologize for the graph, the scaling is a little bit off. I'm not sure why Excel has done this to me, but let's just have a look. So on 1080p we achieved an average FPS of 156, and on 1440p we achieved an average FPS of 159. Now you can see this isn't too much of a difference at all. And for the 1% lows, they're very similar again. 1080p achieved 90 FPS, and we got 83 FPS on 1440p 1% lows. Now you can also see here it's a little bit interesting from the GPU and CPU utilization rates. At 1440p we're at 99% in terms of utilization rate, and at 1080p we were at 80%. But despite this, we have pretty much very similar FPS values. Let's take a look at Overwatch with medium settings and FSR on. We managed to get an average FPS of 179. This is an increase in FPS of 20. From normal 1440p on epic settings. Our average FPS has also increased as well to 120, which is great to see, and our CPU utilization rate has gone up slightly to 54% compared to 49% at 1440p on epic settings, and our GPU utilization rate has fallen from the 1440p epic settings at 99% down to 59% on the medium FSR settings at 1440p. At least we get a smoother experience, and I can definitely say that for sure while playing the game, although we aren't able to reach that 240 Hz threshold. We have good old Marvel Rivals up now on ultra settings, and at 1080p it delivered an FPS of 99 while 1440p was at 98 FPS, so very similar, only a 1% difference. We can see as well the 1% lows were kind of similar again. It was just a difference of 5 FPS. Unfortunately, this game is a little bit difficult to run without some upscaling. As you can see, both in 1080p and 1440p, we had the GPU and CPU utilization rates pretty high already, so it would be interesting to have a look at this game with a much better CPU. Marvel Rivals saw a nice increase when we went to the medium FSR settings at 1440p with an average FPS of 155 and 1% lows being 65. The game did feel a lot smoother, and honestly, with the amount of Marvel Rivals that I've played, you definitely do have to have some sort of upscaling enabled, and FSR definitely achieves that here. We can see that our GPU utilization rate is still pretty high at 84.57%, and the CPU utilization rate is still 81.55%, which is an increase over the normal 1080p and 1440p ultra CPU utilization rates. Unfortunately, in this game we are not able to reach the 240Hz without frame generation, although there are more things that you can turn down in performance in the game's files. But as for this video, we're just going to be using the settings that are available on the actual game. Lastly, we have Valorant on high settings. So as we can see here, we're pretty much good to go with a 5600 and the RX 9070 XT for high refresh gaming, as we had an average FPS of 408 on 1080p and 419 at 1440p. We can see clearly that the 1% lows were decent at 184 on 1080p and 189 on 1440p, so we could benefit from a CPU upgrade, especially in a game like this. But I would like to note as well the big jump in GPU utilization rate from 55% to 75% from 1080p to 1440p. It's always important to remember, as you go up in resolution, you will become more GPU limited compared to CPU limited. But overall, I think in terms of esport gaming, we're pretty much good to go. For these 8 games, 1080p was faster only by 2% for average FPS and for 1% lows. Overall, we had some pretty good results, and notably Valorant came up pretty strong at 1080p and 1440p at 419 FPS on average and 408 on 1080p on average FPS. At 1440p, our weaker results were from Fortnite and Marvel Rivals, and they are a little bit more GPU bound, especially at the higher quality settings. But we did find, of course, when we put the FSR mode on for Marvel Rivals and on medium settings, and Fortnite performance mode, we were more than smooth and good to go for playing at high refresh rates. I think the Ryzen 5 5600 did a really good job with the RX 9070 XT, and of course these aren't AAA games, so we really aren't pushing the RX 9070 XT too hard, but it's good to know you will be able to drop the RX 9070 XT into a budget build, or if you have an older PC with a slightly older CPU like the Ryzen 5 5600. Overall, I think the system performed well at 1080p and 1440p in all of the esport titles. It was clear to me that most of the games we could play at a high refresh rate and with high settings even at 1440p. A few games like Marvel Rivals, for example, we were able to turn some settings down or turn up some upscaling for FSR to help increase the frame rate further. It's good to know that the 5600 could handle the RX 9070 XT with these esport titles, but I do suspect, since these games are a little bit more CPU limited, that a better CPU could help. I found the GPU and CPU utilization rates interesting, and how at 1440p generally the GPU utilization rate scales up. Another consideration is cost. If the RX 9070 XT costs almost 800 USD or more, why not save that money for a better CPU or motherboard combo with your RAM if you're strictly playing esport titles? For esport titles, I would probably recommend looking at upgrading your CPU first, due to the nature of esport games' reliance on the CPU compared to the GPU. Balancing your system would be an important step when using a higher end card like the RX 9070 XT and an older CPU, like in this example. This is especially true if you're going to game at 1080p. You should find that your CPU will matter more as a general rule of thumb in terms of performance. Of course, 1440p and 4K are more GPU limited, but if you're dropping this card into an older system and the CPU cannot produce any more frames, well then it could be a little bit of a waste of money. So yes, you can drop an RX 9070 XT if you want to strictly play esport titles as expected, and you should get decent frame rates. The other reason I had done this benchmark specifically for esport titles is because I'm currently on a test bench system because my main computer is not working at the moment. So I had to switch over to a 5600 on a B350M-A motherboard with my RX 9070 XT. I know, not ideal, but I thought I might as well just use the RX 9070 XT as is and produce a video for you guys. I will repeat these tests with a 7800 X3D as I now have one, and I'm just waiting for a motherboard for it. I will also test some more AAA games with the setup in a future video. Are there any esport titles that I left out? Let me know in the comments, and let me know which ones you want me to test in another video. That about sums up the video. Thank you guys very much for watching. Check out wisetech.org for some more awesome content, but other than that, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!